Many photographers, including many Canon shooters, are looking at Nikon and their amazing new lens offerings for us wildlife photographers with great lenses at all price points pretty much. So naturally the question arises, how do their cameras stack up against the competition, and is it worthwhile making a switch to take advantage of their lens offerings? I'm personally a Canon shooter and I own a lot of Canon gear, but over the course of the last year I've shot just as much with Nikon as I've shot with Canon. There's many things I love about Nikon, but then there's also a few things that definitely make me want to stick with Canon. So let's take a look and find out how each brand performs in the field. When it comes to the handling of the cameras, I'm definitely a fan of the Canon layout with 3 wheels on the camera body because it makes it so much easier to shoot full manual mode, because I have 1 wheel for aperture, 1 for shutter speed and 1 for ISO. With the Nikon cameras, I also get used to the layout pretty quickly with the 2 great wheels on top, but then having to press a button to change the ISO is a little bit annoying because it doesn't have that 3rd wheel in the back of the camera. But overall, both systems are very easy to use in the field, and once you get used to one, you don't really notice the difference. I do wish Nikon had another button on the back of the camera next to the AF on button, because you have to use different autofocusing modes to get the most out of these Nikon cameras, and I like to have them on different buttons on the back of the camera, which is a little bit more tricky, but I've found a workaround. I'm now using the display button as my second autofocusing button on the back of these Nikon bodies. On Canon, this is a little bit easier because we've basically 3 or 4 buttons on the back of the camera that can all be assigned for different autofocusing modes, so there's no shortage of buttons there. Weight-wise, the Z9 is definitely on the heavy side, and it weighs even more than an R5 with an attached battery grip. So in terms of handling in the field, that's a little bit of a downside. It's built super tough, doesn't overheat for videos, so there's definitely advantages to it, but it's definitely a heavy camera. The Z8 somewhat sits in the middle. It's still not a light camera, but with around 900 grams, it handles relatively well in the field, and I wouldn't be too worried about with the weight there. Some of that extra weight on the Z9 comes from its amazing battery that literally lasts forever in the field. This is not quite true for the R5 or the Z8. The R5's battery lasts like a decent amount of time, whereas out of the 3 cameras, the Z8 is definitely the most battery hungry, and you always have to take a few spare batteries with you to make it through a 2 to 3 hour shooting session. With the R5, I would also recommend to have some spare batteries with me, but it seems to last a little bit longer than the Z8. The Z8 and the R5 also come with battery grips. On the R5, I quite like the battery grip because it makes it a nice size to handle, still not too heavy, and I can have a second battery in the camera so it lasts a lot longer. Whereas on the Z8, I didn't like using the battery grip because it makes the camera actually larger than the Z9, and then there's really no point in using the Z8. What really makes the Z8 stand out is the nice size and the nice weight compared to the Z9. So if the battery grip makes it larger, there's really no point in using it, in my opinion at least. When it comes to the card slots, the Z9 is the clear winner with 2 really fast CF Express card slots, whereas both the Z8 and the R5 have 1 CF Express card slot and 1 SD card slot, which is adequate, but of course I think we all wish by now that we could abandon the SD cards and have only the fast cards in the camera, so we have less buffer issues and can just shoot all the time. Talking about the buffer, this seems to be one area that Nikon handles a little bit better. The Canon buffer seems to be a bit larger. However, once you actually hit 0 on the Canon buffer, the camera stops shooting for a few seconds. Whereas on the Nikon, if you ever hit 0 on the buffer, the camera still keeps shooting at a reduced frame rate, so you're less likely to miss a crucial moment. I prefer on the Nikon how you can basically shoot indefinitely. When it comes to the sensor, this is probably where the Z8 and the Z9 separate themselves the most from the R5, because the Z8 and the Z9 have a 45 megapixel stacked BSI sensor, which basically means we have fast readout speed, and that also means we have no rolling shutter and no blackout in the viewfinder. So it's a fantastic shooting experience, and you're getting beautiful images where you don't have to be concerned about any sort of image wobbles or the rolling shutter effect. On the R5, we get a beautiful sensor with good noise performance and good colors, but it has a relatively slow readout speed in comparison, which means we have to deal with rolling shutter and some image wobbles, which is definitely not fun in the field. When it comes to the high ISO performance, it seems up to like 3200 the cameras are very similar, but then at 6400 and 12800 or beyond, the R5 seems to be a little bit less noisy. However, if you have a good workflow like I teach in my masterclass and you use good noise reduction software in my ProSets for instance, both of these files from all brands will clean up very well, and in the end the final images will look very similar. So while the Canon seems to have a slight edge in the noise performance, The final images look pretty much identical, so there's no real concern there, but if you look at the files side by side without any noise reduction run on it, the R5 seems to be a little bit less noisy. And if you want to learn the right workflow to get the most out of your RAW files, I would highly recommend that you check out my masterclass where I teach you everything you need to know in Photoshop to make your own images look amazing. And while you're at it, you should also check out my pro sets where I allow you with just one click to transform your RAW files, and it will make your editing process so much easier. So if you're interested in these, make sure to check them out down there in the description. So overall, these cameras are quite similar and you can get amazing images with them, yet there's two main areas where they are quite different. The first one is the sensor part, where Nikon wins easily, and the second one is the autofocus, where I would give the edge to Canon. It's not so much that the autofocus tracking itself is that far superior on the Canon cameras, but the subject recognition definitely is. Canon cameras can identify the subject from much larger distances and with much more precision, and they just seem to know what the subject is and what the background is, for instance. The Nikon camera seems to struggle a lot more identifying what is the subject and what you actually want to focus on. And even once a subject is acquired, it still jumps on and off your subject at times, especially when there's like water or a more busy background involved. The other thing I enjoy more about the Canon autofocus is how easy it is to use and to set up. Basically, out of the box, it already works quite well and most people will have fantastic success with it. Whereas the Nikon autofocus is a little bit more work. First of all, you have to set it up the right way. And secondly, even once you set it up the right way to perform the best, it's still more involved to work in the field, whereas Canon just feels more like press one button and be done. While both work fantastically well, there's definitely an edge in Canon when it comes to subject recognition, knowing what the subject is, and the ease of use. On Canon cameras, I like to use double back button autofocusing. On the star button, I assign my base autofocusing mode, which is the spot autofocus. So I can move my autofocus field around to wherever I want, press the star button, and the camera will focus on that exact point. I'm not actually focusing with the front shutter button, I only use that to take my images. And then the second button on the back of the camera, the AF on button, I assign to the eye tracking. So whenever I press the AF on button, the camera will find the bird or the subject and will track it all over my frame. In the Nikon cameras, the setup is a little bit more difficult, but I've set up the Z8 and the Z9 the same way. My base autofocusing mode is a custom wide area large, the widest area possible. And I use that to cheat a little bit, because to get the best results, you need to hand off from the wide area mode to the 3D tracking. I'm saying I'm cheating a little bit because I'm using the wide area large as my base autofocusing mode. I disable the shutter button focusing and I assign the focusing for the wide area to the display button on the back of the camera. But I don't usually actually press the display button. I just use the wide area large to find a bird for me. So whenever a bird appears in my viewfinder, the wide area large will put a little gray box around the bird and basically indicates that it could track it now. And now when I press the AF on button that I have assigned the 3D tracking to, the 3D tracking will take over from the spot that the wide area large previously indicated with the gray box. I get a green box and now the camera will track the bird all over the viewfinder for me with the 3D tracking. So while I'm handing off from the wide area to the 3D tracking, I actually only have to press one button in the back of the camera, which makes it much easier for me to use the Z8 and the Z9, and the autofocus feels a little bit more similar to Canon and feels a little bit more easier to use overall. And if you want to learn more how I set up my cameras like a Z8, Z9, R5, R7, R3, etc., I've linked a few setup guides for you down there in the description that will definitely help you to master the setting up of your own cameras. When it comes to action photography, this is where we see the biggest differences between these cameras. Especially against busier backgrounds or water backgrounds, the Nikon cameras struggle, whereas Canon seems to be able to identify the subject and just stick to the subject without being distracted by like waves in the background, for instance. If the bird didn't fill a large portion of your frame, it seemed like both the Z8 and the Z9 just couldn't identify what's the water, what's the subject, what do you actually want me to focus on, and that would just jump off from the seagull onto the water, back onto the bird, and back onto the water. So it was quite difficult to focus on anything with the water background. The further away the background, the easier it was for the cameras to nail the focus, and I still got some amazing shots, but overall it was a little bit of a struggle. I wasn't quite sure how the R5 would perform in a similar setting, but I took it there the other day and the differences were quite dramatic. There's an example of this gannet here, for instance. It's tiny in my frame, but the R5 picked it up without any issues and tracked it a long time against the wave, never once jumping onto the wave and back to the bird. It was just stick to the bird without problems at all. And this is definitely a trend I saw with the R5 at that cliff. This is the biggest difference for me between the Nikon and the Canon autofocus at the moment. The Canon autofocus just seems to know this is the subject, so it just tracks it and it doesn't get distracted by anything else coming into your frame or the waves behind the bird, whereas the Nikon autofocus doesn't quite seem to know what you actually want from it and jumps on and off a lot more. So while the Canon autofocus seems to still have a little bit of an edge in subject recognition and being sort of certain what to track, both of these autofocus systems deliver fantastic results in the field, and I wouldn't have any hesitation using the Nikon autofocusing system, but at the same time, in direct comparison, Canon definitely stands out at still having a bit of an edge, also because it's so much easier to set up and to use. Nikon definitely has one advantage though when it comes to action photography, and that is the blackout-free shooting in the viewfinder. With Canon, it's a bit more of a slideshow, whereas with the Nikon cameras, you get nice and clear views and it's much easier to track the birds. It's a bit of a back and forth between these cameras, isn't it? The sensor performance is so much better than Nikon, but then the autofocus for Canon is a little bit better. And now we're back to an area where Nikon clearly stands out, the image stabilization. On Canon cameras, the IBIS and the image stabilization in the lenses work very well. You can do handheld video and you can shoot at low shutter speeds. Yet it's no comparison to what Nikon can do when it comes to the image stabilization. Your viewfinder simply doesn't move. The IBIS in the Z8 and the Z9 is amazing, and in combination with the VR in the lenses, you can handhold video even with long, heavy lenses, no problem at all. There's no shakes, no wobbles, it's just amazing. And you can also shoot at very low shutter speed and expect some good results even at like a 30th of a second handheld. So whatever Nikon has done to the image stabilization, it's simply amazing, and I wish Canon was on the same level. When it comes to video, the abilities of the three cameras are actually quite similar. They can all record 4K up to 120 frames per second, and they all can record 8K as well. And the Z9, I think the Z8 as well, can even record 8K 60p. So that's pretty cool, and there's a few other areas where the Nikon cameras stand out, especially the Z9, because it doesn't seem to overheat in any mode and you can record for very long times. The Z8 seems to overheat a little bit quicker, but it still never got to the point where it affected me in the field, whereas my R5, I had it overheat from time to time. It hasn't happened as much with the latest firmware, but overheating is definitely more of a concern with the R5. What I really like about the Nikon cameras as well is that you can record ProRes internally, which is quite nice on my preferred file format for editing. So having that built into the camera and being able to record that directly is very nice. Overall, the files that come out of each camera are very nice, easy to work with, and I get fantastic results with the R5, the Z8 and the Z9. So the differences there are not super dramatic for me and all give you great results. And when it comes to the autofocus, unlike the photo autofocus where Nikon lags a little bit behind, in the video autofocus I feel like they're at least on par or even slightly better than the Canon cameras. They track your subject very well all over the viewfinder and don't really have any problems tracking it and finding it and sticking to it, and basically never jump onto the background. So I'm very happy with the Nikon autofocus when it comes to video, and I would give the overall edge to Nikon as well when it comes to video, mainly because they also have that amazing image stabilization. So having good image features, no rolling shutter, and the ability to do a lot of handheld video even with big lenses definitely makes me want to switch just for the video abilities. So while the Nikon cameras feel more refined in the field and have a little bit of an edge overall when it comes to performance, also due to the great image stabilization, Canon still doesn't have to hide, and the R5 performs very well, especially when it comes to the autofocus. So no one is really going to switch brands just because there's a new camera, or you don't go from a Z8 to an R5 on R5 to Z8. The main reason you would switch brands is actually because of the lens lineup. And this is where Nikon truly stands out at the moment. They pretty much have a lens for everyone at many different attractive price points. For us wildlife photographers, there's so many amazing options now. We have the $1,700 180 to 600mm lens that are already used in the field and got some great images with. We have a 100 to 400mm lens. We have a 4.5 400mm lens that's super nice and light. We have a 600mm TC lens. There's just so many amazing lenses that we can choose from. And of course, we also have the 800mm PF lens that comes in at a great price point with a small weight that performs fantastically in the field as well. So there's many options for us wildlife photographers, and that would really be the main reason I see people switching brands. Am I gonna switch brands? Well, I really enjoyed using Nikon, but I'm not quite ready yet. I would definitely want to see what an R5 Mark II looks like and an R1 will look like. For me, as someone who shoots a lot of video, that amazing image stabilization is very attractive in the Nikon lineup. However, there's one lens in the Canon lineup that kind of stops me from switching brands just yet, and that's the amazing 100 to 500mm lens. There's simply no lens the other brands have on offer that compete with this lens because it just offers me so much flexibility, great image stabilization, and amazing sharpness. Nikon has 100 to 400 and now the 180 to 600mm lens, but in order to make up for the 100 to 500mm lens, I would have to take both of these lenses with me, and they're much heavier and much bigger. What I think it's truly missing from the Nikon lineup at the moment is not lenses, but cheaper camera bodies. Canon has a fantastic lineup of APC and full frame cameras that don't break the bank, whereas if you're looking at the Nikon lineup, only really the Z8 and the Z9 are currently in a position to compete with the Canon lineup. All the lower end bodies truly struggle when it comes to the autofocus performance and wouldn't quite stack up in a comparison to an R5, for instance, or even like an R8 or an R6. So hopefully over the course of the next year, we will see some more APC cameras and cheaper full frame cameras from Nikon that have that great autofocus performance that will then truly allow you to take advantage of the cheaper lenses as well. Because at the moment, you're having cheaper lenses, but there's not really any good cheaper cameras to pair them with. So fingers crossed, we will see some interesting bodies from Nikon coming out very soon. And I'm also excited to see what the R5 Mark II and the R1 will look like from Canon. I'd love to hear from you guys. Now, what are your experiences with Nikon and Canon? Have you used both of the brands? Have you used an R5 and a Z8 or Z9? Please share your experiences in the comments. Or are you tempted by the current Nikon lens offerings and feel like ditching Canon and jumping ship over to Nikon? And what camera would you be considering with Nikon? Because that's definitely one of the main issues still, that there's no cheaper cameras available that have that amazing autofocus performance that the Z8 and the Z9 can give you. Overall, between the three cameras, the Z8, the Z9 and the R5, it seems to be a little bit of a wash in the field. Canon has the better autofocus, but Nikon has the better sensor and the better image stabilization. So it's very hard to pick a clear winner here. There's not one camera that stands out that nails everything. So for now, personally, I'm going to stay put. I'm going to see what happens over the course of the next year and then make my final decision which brand will be my brand going forward. What are your choices? Are you already looking over to the dark side and the amazing lens offering, or are you also staying put with your current brand, seeing what's going to happen in the market? Let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up for this video. Make sure to check out also my channel membership, where you get some great member perks for just a small fee and can directly support me. And make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next video very soon. Bye.